Okay, it's day 307, and what I want to talk about today is Sergey Lavrov, because he's absolutely nuts. And I'm going to talk about exactly how he's nuts in just a little bit. Before we get into the day's events, though, I want you to know that I'm on Twitter at Dr. Gerdes. You can see it right here at Dr_Gerdes. And I want to know from you, please put it in the comments below, but who are the people on Twitter that you follow that you trust the most? Like who are really solid sources? Let me know. Help me, help you, help everybody. All right. And let's get into the day's events. The day's events: Russians pound Bakhmut, Advinka, in the east, with millions of Ukrainians struggling without electricity. So Russian forces have unleashed fresh attacks in the eastern Ukrainian towns of Bakhmut, Advinka, backed by formidable artillery fire. That is today. Russian troops launched 2 missile strikes and 44 rockets on Ukrainian positions in populated areas over the last 24 hours. And nearly 9 million people are still left without power because of energy shortages. So nothing has really changed there. I saw this article and I thought it was awesome. Christmas off, then straight to the war. This guy is part of the International Legion, and there's 2 things I want to highlight for you here. Just 2 lines. It doesn't feel like Christmas, to be honest. Mentally, we have switched back to game time, so the Ukrainians are back in the mix, ready to roll. Now, there's this line below that that's really, really important, because you can't buy this. Like 45 billion, yeah, that's a really good day, but that's not, you can't buy what I'm about to talk about next. Morale. Although morale is sky high among the soldiers, he sees the daily struggle for ordinary Ukrainians. Now, I want to talk about the first clause in the sentence. Morale is sky high for the soldiers. Now, that's really, really important, because there's a multiplier. Morale is a multiplier. The moral is to the physical, is 3 is to the 1, and that's really, really important. Okay, let's switch gears. Let's talk about our main topic for today. Russia's Lavrov issues ultimatum to Ukraine for your own good. Oh boy, this should be great. So I looked at it and I saw a number of articles saying the same thing, and I went to the original sources as well, as is my custom. He said our proposals for the demilitarization and denazification of the territories controlled by the regime, the elimination of threats to Russian security emanating from there, including our new lands, are well known to the enemy. The point is simple. Fulfill them for your own good. Otherwise, the issue will be decided by the Russian army, Lavrov said. I don't think it will be. I don't think, if you could have decided it, you would have decided it already. So I don't think that's the case. Now, he also says in other places, that was Al Jazeera, this is Reuters, and he's saying the United States and NATO allies together with Ukraine want to defeat Russia on the battlefield in order to destroy it. Well, there's something very correct about that. Here's the article in Task where he says the same stuff. The actions by the collective West and their puppet Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky confirm the global nature of the Ukrainian crisis. It is no secret that the strategic goal of the U.S. and its NATO allies is to win a victory over Russia on the battlefield as a mechanism of weakening or even destroying our country. Okay, so it's a little hyperbolic, but he's kind of right. Okay, so I actually kind of agree with him on this. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to listen to, now, this is Ben Shapiro, if you're not familiar with Ben Shapiro. Ben Shapiro is a very, very conservative political commentator, if you're not familiar with him. He's pretty well known. And there's this split between conservatives in the United States, and he's a fairly thoughtful commentator. I want you to hear what he has to say about this destroy Russia kind of concept.
Because Russia is a very poor country. I mean, it really is. Russia's GDP total is about the GDP of the state of Florida. Russia is not a rich country. Russia is, as some people have suggested, an oil station with a nuclear arsenal. And because of that, Russia's conventional military was defeated by Ukraine, which was armed with NATO weaponry, which actually is significantly upgraded weaponry over whatever the Russians have to offer. So Russia has been forced back. That is in the interest of the United States. It upholds the deterrent power of NATO. It degrades Russia's conventional military to the extent that Russia is going to have a very tough time with adventurous ambitions in terms of foreign policy and violating other countries' borders, which is good for the world. Stability is generally a good thing. Violation of borders is generally a bad thing.
Yep.
And it deters China as well, because again, the cost that Russia has now borne is so significant that if China is looking at Taiwan and thinking to itself, maybe we'll try that, well, looking at what happened to Russia, not wonderful if you're China.
Okay, this is a core plank in my thinking as well, and that is when my conservative friends that are kind of in the populist side, America First kind of thing, and we don't want to have anything to do with that, say, I don't want World War III. I say I don't want World War III either, and that's the reason, because I want to prevent other dictators who are watching this from doing this, let alone preventing Putin from doing the same. Okay, keep going, because you're going to hear how the money plays out and the impact of the budget.
Now, China's gotten some side benefits, like namely, it's been able to turn Russia into its giant oil field. Russia's been shipping all of its oil to China. Instead of China once being a client state of the Soviet Union, now Russia is essentially a client state of China.
And remember, I talked about how that was inversing. So I think that's very true.
So in some ways, it's maximized Chinese powers, but in other ways, it's actually degraded a very strong strategic ally of the Chinese and made it harder for them to engage in adventurous foreign policy in Taiwan. So the United States has achieved a bunch of interests with regard to the Ukraine war. And as far as the investment that the United States has made in the Ukraine war, again, we've expended no lives in the Ukraine war. We've expended a fair bit of money in the Ukraine war. But the truth is that the amount of money that we have spent in 2022 amounts to approximately 6% of total U.S. defense spending. In 2022, the U.S. defense budget was $715 billion. The amount that we've spent in Ukraine is something like $77 billion. It'll raise to maybe $100 billion. It's a lot of money. It is a lot of money. But it represents a fraction of the United States' military budget. If you could trade, say, 10% of the American military budget for the complete degradation of the Russian military, that actually is not a bad move, considering that the Ukrainian armed forces have already killed or wounded at least 100,000 Russian troops. That is half of its original fighting force. There have been almost 8,000 confirmed losses of armored vehicles, including thousands of tanks, thousands of APCs, artillery pieces, hundreds of fixed and rotary wing aircraft, numerous naval vessels. So basically, we've destroyed half of the Russian military by just giving the weapons to Ukraine.
Now, that's a little bit overblown, not half of the Russian military, but a big chunk of it. And 100,000 killed or wounded is the American figure. So it is probably a bit higher than that if you use the Ukrainian numbers or other. I mean, the American figure is just using statistical methods, as I understand. Okay, just a little bit more.
So that is a pretty solid return. I mean, the truth is that on a year-to-year level, the amount of money that we'd be spending in the American military budget in order to counter whatever moves the Russians are making would easily be that amount of money. And here you're talking about a one-time expenditure that has taken out an extraordinary percentage of the Russian military. So, is it in America's interest to fund this? Sure. Now the question becomes...
Okay, now he's right there with me, and now he's going to ask a really important question. Now the question becomes
what the end of this war looks like.
Okay, and now he's going to go he's going to vacillate a little bit back and forth, but that's not the point. I want you to hear this part, and now with that in place, let's continue with what Lavrov was saying. Okay, now with that in mind, let's turn our attention to Lavrov and what he had to say. Okay, so the enemy is well aware of our proposals on the demilitarization and denazification, and he's talking about including the territories of the LPR, DPR, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions, the minister said. There's little left to do to accept these proposals in an amicable way. Otherwise, the Russian army will defeat. Okay, so we already been over that ground. Now, Jake Bro, and I'm going to point you to this at the end, but I'm going to do it again now. In yesterday's episode, this is the Estonian prime minister, I believe, who's talking about how when Russians negotiate, they always go for the maximalist thing and they never back off, which is why yesterday I proposed that the Ukrainians say, no, we want these territories from Russia as well. Because why should only Ukraine have something on the table to lose? It should be the other way around. So he also talked about how he wasn't going to engage in projects with the EU. We can kiss those goodbye. Naturally, there will be no more business as usual with the counterparties, that is the EU. We do not intend to either knock on closed doors or initiate any joint projects. Russia's top diplomat emphasized, thank God the world is not just the European Union for us, and we have lots of friends and like-minded nations elsewhere. Well, the like-minded nations that you have elsewhere are folks like Iran and Syria, Belarus, North Korea, maybe China, who doesn't want sanctions. So you got to be careful with that kind of thing. You're not as secure as you think you are. Okay, let's look at RT and hear about this. The U.S. should be thinking twice before contemplating decapitation strike, says Lavrov. Huh? Decapitation strike? Who's talking about a decapitation strike? Reported comments by U.S. officials about the possibility of a decapitation strike against Russia strongly suggest that Washington does not rule out the assassination of President Vladimir Putin. Yeah, I think that's actually kind of a bad idea, and I'll tell you why. One, I don't want to make Putin a martyr, but beyond that, all kinds of crazy bad things can go wrong. I want to defeat Ukraine militarily on the battlefield so that people can get their children back. I don't want to create chaos in Russia in such a way that we don't know who's in charge or is splitting into different warlord and tribal factions and that kind of thing, and then you never get your children back. I want you to be defeated and then have to say, uncle, and yes, we're getting these children back and people that are captured and reparations and whatever else. Okay, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said in an interview, the minister noted that some unnamed officials from the Pentagon actually threatened to conduct a decapitation strike on the Kremlin. What we are talking about is the threat of physical elimination of the head of the Russian state. The top diplomat went on to warn against such a line of thinking. If such ideas are actually being nourished by someone, this someone should think very carefully about the process of consequences of such plans. This is one of the few places where I actually agree with him, although he's usually nuts. Because again, you want Russia's economy to grind down so it can't support the military, so the military can be defeated on the battlefield. What you do not want, absolutely do not want, is Russia in total chaos. And Russia has a history of violent revolutions, so this would not be good for trying. Look, I have 6 kids, right? If my kid was lost in my city, I would be frantic. I mean, I would be paralyzed. I don't know what I'd be able to do. Just imagine if your child was deported to another country, right? In that kind of chaos, you're not getting them back. But in a defeated scenario where they have to do this by, the rule of the conquered, having the rule of what they're going to do, that's how you get them back. Okay, I've belabored that long enough. Let's keep going. Okay, U.S. considers alternative options for a state sponsor of terrorism. So the State Department is the one that gets to say who is a state sponsor of terrorism and who is not. So it's part of the executive branch, the president, and then the State Department, and they get to do that. The Senate voted like 97 to nothing or 97 to 2 or something like that. It was very small. It was overwhelmingly 97 something to call them a state sponsor of terrorism. But of course, the Senate doesn't actually decide that. The U.S. Congress is considering the possibility of finding a new category for the status of Russia, calling it an, quote, aggressor state, terrorist state, or aggressor state that commits terrorist acts against civilians. So they're trying to carve out a middle ground because the list of state sponsors are like their friends. North Korea, Syria, Cuba, Iran. Those are state sponsors of terrorism. And if you label Russia with that, it's like burning a significant bridge. Now, the Ukrainian ambassador was saying, so that on one hand we call Russia correctly, and on the other some restrictions are included that allows it to further restrict Russia. Surely we understand that it's not a sponsor of terrorism, like they're not sending other groups to go sponsor. I guess they kind of are with Wagner or something along those lines, but that's not the point. The point is that they're doing this thing. Now, how do we properly label this thing? And it's very kind to split the difference and be kind with that language as this ambassador is doing. But at the same time, I think you ought to just go with state sponsor of terrorism because that's essentially what they're doing. Markova said that the first question is, what will we call Russia? Now, here's the catch. The second is what will stand behind this name. Like, so if we do call them a terrorist state or aggressor state that commits terrorist acts, what are the sanctions that come with that? What happens to them exactly? And we have to work that out. Okay. Next, here on Twitter, this was actually just one of the most bizarre things. Now, Dmitry Medvedev says really bizarre things a lot, but this was a really, really, really bizarre thing. He says, on the New Year's Eve, everyone's into making predictions. Here are our humble contributions. What can happen in 2023? And he starts predicting some loony things. Oil prices will rise to $150 a barrel. It could happen. I don't see it, but it could. The UK will rejoin the EU. I'm not seeing that anytime soon. The EU will collapse after the UK's return. Euro will drop out of use as the former EU currency. Even less likelihood. Like, this is almost negative probability of that happening. Poland and Hungary will occupy western regions of the formerly existing Ukraine. This is like Russian fantasy, right? The EU will break up. Poland will take over Ukraine, and Hungary, like, I've seen maps where they were talking about this is what will be left after Russia carves up the eastern half and Poland and Hungary take up the, right? The Fourth Reich will be created, encompassing the territory of Germany and its satellites, e.g. Poland and the Baltic states, Chechnya, Slovakia, Kiev Republic, and other outcasts. Okay? War will break out between France and the Fourth Reich. Europe will be divided, Poland repartitioned in the process. Northern Ireland will separate from the UK and join the Republic of Ireland. Civil war will break out in the U.S. California and Texas will be becoming independent states as a result. Texas and Mexico will form an allied state. Elon Musk will win the presidential election in a number of states, which after the new civil wars end will have been given to the GOP. And the large stock markets and financial activity will leave the US and Europe and move to Asia. Again, fevered imagination of what Russia would absolutely hope would happen. And number 10, the Bretton Woods system of monetary management will collapse. So if you don't know what Bretton Woods is, it's basically after World War II, the dollar became kind of the standard currency used around the world to denominate trade. And you do that because it was a fairly stable kind of standard, and your currency and your currency get to trade with this at this rate. And so if something happens in either of your countries, it's a little less risky to say in dollar denominated. But that's Bretton Woods. The Bretton Woods system of monetary management will collapse, leading to the IMF and the World Bank to crash. The euro will drop circulating as the euro and dollar will stop circulating as the global reserve currencies. Digital fiat currencies will be actively used instead. Again, fevered imagination. Season's greetings to all of you Anglo-Saxon friends and their happily oinking piglets. Okay, nice. To which Elon Musk responded, and this was picked up in RT, where he responded to that and said, Musk called these series of posts an epic thread. Now, when he said that, I thought I didn't read it like what they say, but this is kind of how RT was spinning it. Hours later, after a backlash over supposedly betraying the interests of the U.S. and his own businesses, he clarified his position. But I didn't hear it like that. I heard it like, yeah, you're epic, you're crazy. Because they kind of are. I mean, anytime you see Dmitry Medvedev's telegram, it's crazy stuff. But Musk clarified, quote, those are definitely the most absurd predictions I've ever heard, while also showing an astonishing lack of awareness of the progress of artificial intelligence and sustainable energy. That's a good point. Now, this was also interesting. Ukraine War Foreign Minister says that Kyiv wants peace summit by the end of February. So Dmytro Kuleba was telling journalists that the peace summit should be held by the end of February at the United Nations with Secretary General Antonio Guterres as mediator. But Kuleba doesn't anticipate Russia taking part. Like, Russia would just boycott that meeting is what he's saying, he's anticipating. So RT carried this. Moscow responds to Kyiv's peace summit idea. Kyiv's proposal of a so-called peace summit amid a conflict with Moscow would be impossible if Russia is not invited. Representative to the UN, Dmitry Polansky, said on Tuesday. Kuleba also demanded that before Moscow be allowed to join at a negotiating table, it should face an international court and be prosecuted for its alleged war crimes. So they'll be invited after they face an international court. And the UN ambassador from Russia said, what peace summit could be without Russia? He asked, adding, however, that is not difficult to imagine such an event taking place without Ukraine. Well, it's also not hard for him to imagine annexing 4 of Ukrainian oblasts without, Ukraine being invited to have any say in it. So, yeah, this guy's just as nuts as the others. All right, just a little bit more. 70 of 250 Iranian-made drones supplied to Russia, second batch already destroyed. Now, this is really interesting. 70 of 250, that's a pretty substantial figure. They're already destroyed. Now, I talked about Jake Bro earlier, and I'm telling you, go watch Hamsters. To go watch this particular episode or video, and it was just posted a little while ago, because in this, he does the math and shows that they traded 250 of these drones for 24 Su-35 planes. And he does the math at how bad of a deal Russia got in that. So I highly recommend that you go see that you go look at that. And subscribe if you're not already a subscriber to Jake Bro. And thank you for watching my videos. I appreciate that. I would also ask that if you're not already a subscriber on my channel, that you subscribe and then you click that bell so you can get all the notifications and so that you don't miss anything that's going on. And finally, if you want to support what I do, you can buy me a coffee. That will go into a fund for my children. It's to thank them for the time that has been taken from them while I do these, and so we can just go do some fun things together just to make good for the time spent. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.